This is the second part of a mini-series detailing an intelligent race of aliens that evolved on a gas giant. They're called the Age, they're absolutely massive, and for a long time their society was fragmented between three different groups. But last we left off, the most downtrodden of these groups, known as the Spirit Walkers, were successful in conquering the other two, and even embarked on the start of their space age. From there, they began to hesitantly colonize the stars, but there was one problem. They knew nothing about space. Having evolved in some of the lowest regions of the atmosphere, these missions were the first time they had ever seen the stars, so even after they had created competent spacecrafts, they didn't really know what to do with them. And so, they traveled to the first thing they found, that being the red, hypergiant star at the center of their system. It took them years to get there, and even longer to learn much of anything about it, but eventually they found what they had all silently hoped, that this star was an incredible source of energy. It wasn't long before they developed an early prototype of a Dyson satellite, which was essentially the same technology as a Dyson sphere, just on a much smaller scale. You can think of it as a moon-sized solar panel that closely orbited the sun. In short, the Ages had begun their development of Dyson technology before they had colonized, explored, or even discovered a single other planet. But it wouldn't be much longer before they had done all of the above. The first planet fully colonized and terraformed by the Age was another ice giant in the same star system called Myra. But Myra was much smaller than Chus, about half its size, which meant the atmosphere was significantly less dense. And so, even after terraforming, the only region of the planet with a high enough air pressure to support Age life was the area directly surrounding the core. This led to a population of Myrans that grew more and more accustomed to walking on solid Earth, and as their people's technology continued to advance and their prowess of genetic modification grew more impressive, they began to modify their own children for a lifespan entirely on the ground. This new race, known as the Holliers, had their dexterous tentacles transformed into elephantine legs and their bony jaws greatly reduced. Many factions of Age society looked down on the Holliers for this bizarre terrestrial lifestyle, but it was thanks to this lifestyle that they were ultimately granted great wealth and political power. You see, metal was a fickle resource on these planets, since it was found almost exclusively in the core. And on a planet like Chus, where the core is surrounded by such a dense and dangerous atmosphere, the Age have had no choice but to harvest their metal through other means, specifically through the native wildlife. While most animals never go anywhere near the core, others, like the Gutnan, live the majority of their lives down there. In that time, they're able to form iron scales in their soft skin in a similar way as the scaly-foot gastropods of Earth. When the Gutnan are eventually killed or eaten, their predators are able to absorb and utilize the iron in much the same way, slowly bringing the metal higher into the atmosphere until the Ages are able to harvest it for themselves. Using these methods, the Age have been able to find enough metal to kickstart their industrial revolution, but it was still a fairly rare item, especially when compared to the Holliers' environment, where they were literally walking across Myra's metal terrain on a daily basis. And so, the Myrans commenced to mining the core and trading the resultant metal all throughout Age society, becoming filthy rich in the process. But despite their great wealth, the Holliers would never have the most widespread body plan amongst the Age. That honor would go to another Myran native known as the Smallwings. They too were a genetically modified race given a much smaller form that allowed for life in lighter atmospheres, such as the upper regions of Myra. The Smallwings proved incredibly adept for space travel, since their minuscule size allowed for cheaper but still effective autoclave suits. In fact, it was them that colonized the first out-of-system planet, another gas giant called Oshk. Oshk was a large planet, even for a gas giant, so large that it could have been thought of as a failed star, being closer to a brown dwarf than a regular giant. Needless to say, this necessitated even more drastic changes to the Age's body plan. While the Smallwings had grown smaller, so too did the residents of Oshk, known as the Dwarfkin. In addition to their reduced size, they implemented pressurized organs, thicker skin, and even an internal skeleton to counteract the immense gravitational pressure of the planet. Over time, these changes resulted in steadily less transparent skin, and eventually a set of external eyes, making the Dwarfkin the most heavily derived subspecies so far. There would be hundreds of other planets colonized by the Age, but perhaps the most interesting was Niai. Unlike the other worlds in the Age's interstellar empire, Niai was a rocky planet, still with a fairly dense atmosphere, but nowhere near the same extent as their other colony worlds. And so, the traditional Age body plan had to change. Not even the Smallwings were light enough for this environment. While you may have expected the reintroduction of a terrestrial body plan for such a domain, the naturally buoyant Age opted instead for a flighted design, resulting in the high streamers, strange bird-like creatures whose fins became wings and whose jaws became skinny legs adapted for perching. They were indisputably seen as the runts of the group, measuring around 6 meters compared to the 36 meters of an average Age. And thanks to their strange environment, far more alien than any of the other colony worlds, it took them a long time to find their footing, as they relied on the homeworld for resources throughout most of their history. But just as these advancements were taking place in the galaxy at large, things were still changing on the homeworld of Chus. Deep within the atmosphere, well beyond the lesser maelstrom, there was a fundamentalist group of spirit walkers known as the Delving Guild. They believed their people should have never left the land of the dead, and while their faith began with a small, mostly unheard of following, it slowly grew more influential over time, especially as the Chusian natives began to be outpaced by the other races occupying the colony worlds. Their ultimate goal was to cultivate the core of Chus, just as the Holliers had done on Myra, and after generations of slow progress, they had finally formed the first permanent settlement on solid ground. But just a few years after its founding, this fundamentalist colony was met with a terrible plague. This region of the atmosphere was endemic to a small-bodied scavenger known as the Altaki. These creatures were the most frequent distributors of the ENS virus, which is essentially rabies, but way worse. Once inflicted with the ENS virus, large growths will begin to form around the host's brain, limiting their capacity for reasoned thought and amplifying their aggression. From there, they begin to lash out and infect others. As more became infected, the entire colony was eventually overrun, and when the fundamentalist refugees began to flee higher into the atmosphere, they took the virus with them. As a whole, the Age's understanding of medicine was still a little loose. After the pastoralist genocide, they had never rediscovered germ theory or invested much into medical technology. So once the pandemic began, there was no stopping it. The entire atmosphere was bombarded with the shambling hosts of this terrifying disease. All trade to and from the planet was permanently cut off as to slow the spread of the virus. And after years of steady decline, the natives of Chus had all been wiped out, until only the infected remained. This did little to affect planets like Myra and Oshk, which had grown advanced enough on their own as to not need the withering Chus. But not all planets were so lucky. For every world like Myra, strong and independent, there were a dozen like Niai that still relied on their homeworld for resources. So as Chus was reduced to a smoldering hell pit, countless other planets followed. Some were pulled back to a technological dark age, while others simply went extinct altogether. This left the Age's galactic empire with a strange dichotomy of developed and simple worlds. But these two groups would actually interact with one another far more often than you may expect. After all, they still shared the same airspace, and it wasn't too uncommon for a single star system to hold several developed and underdeveloped worlds, nor for an interstellar trade route to pass over several simple settlements. This resulted in countless cargo cults popping up all over Age society. Sometimes a Hollier ship would crash in the atmosphere of an uncontacted world, and the tribal residents of that world would discover and utilize its wreckage. Other times a passenger vessel would crash, and the natives would form followings around its survivors. The most influential of these cults was the On-Frim Society, a group of simple small wings that were taught to reverse engineer spacecraft by a shipwrecked castaway named On-Frim. But the most interesting is probably the Shrixie Confederation, a band of natives that formed a religion around airdrop Shrixies, which are essentially a breed of fancy designer pets, kind of like Borzois or hairless cats. One underdeveloped world that had close to no contact with the rest of Age society were the High Streamers. Thanks to the planet's strange environment, the other races had little interest in re-exploring the surface of Niai, allowing the native residents to learn and adapt on their own. For tens of thousands of years, the only connection the High Streamers had to their extraterrestrial cousins was when they spotted the occasional low-flying ship tracing through their atmosphere. These ships were practically indistinguishable from shooting stars, but fittingly enough, shooting stars have been reimagined in High Streamer mythology as the chariots of distant gods. Once, during the early years of Niai's Bronze Age, there had been a devastating space battle just beyond their atmosphere. This battle lasted weeks and could be seen at one point or another at just about every part of the planet. For this reason, it was immortalized in countless holy texts, where it was described as a war between gods, a divine parade, or the consummation of two angels. That last interpretation was the most popular by far, and thousands of years later, when the first fleet of ships were sent to colonize the moon of Niai, the leading craft was named Union of Angels, though most of the passengers simply called it Angel Sex. From there, the High Streamers spent the next 100 years slowly exploring the countless star systems surrounding their planet. They had surely become a fairly widespread species, spanning dozens of worlds, but since they were colonizing rocky planets instead of gas giants, it was a long time before they found another Age. And when they eventually did, the two groups could hardly even recognize each other. On the frozen surface of a long-since-abandoned moon, High Streamer cosmonauts explored the derelict remains of what appeared to be a city. But little by little, as they traversed the winding streets, they realized this was not a forsaken settlement, but an active, planet-spanning computer. Thousands of years earlier, shortly after the Chusian outbreak, the small wings, Holliers, and other races living within the homeworld star system grew increasingly paranoid that the ENS virus would spread beyond Chus's atmosphere and infect everybody, especially once foolhardy pirates began to explore the abandoned planet in search of forgotten treasure. This paranoia came to a head when a futurist group started work on a massive supercomputer capable of uploading a person's consciousness into a robotic body. After generations of work, as the issues were increasingly ironed out, more and more Ages had abandoned their biological forms in favor of a new artificial visage. Eventually, there were more mechanical Ages than biological ones, and while this brought comfort to the disease-fearing society for a while, they were eventually overwhelmed by a new fear, that being the loss of their memories. And so they developed something of a hard drive in the form of a massive planet-spanning computer that could store their past and present memories in the event that something happened to their mechanical body. But as it turned out, the hot, turbulent environment of a gas giant is a non-optimal location for such an advanced computer. So instead, they were constructed on the surface of orbiting moons. Or, colder still, they were constructed in space in the form of a thin, mile-long ring. By this point in their history, just about every Age in the homeworld star system had joined the simulated dream, a decision that would ultimately prove to save them, not only from the ENS virus, but also from the inevitable end of their sun. It was only a matter of time before the red hypergiant star at the center of their system went supernova, and when it did, the vast majority of planets and moons were destroyed, leaving naught but the lucky few that were flung out into the distant void. This would have surely meant the end of any biological settlements that remained on those ejected worlds, but did little to affect the continental computers that stood in their stead. From there, the mechanical Ages mostly retreated inwards. Having lost their familiar surroundings, they coped by simulating new worlds within the confines of their own mind. Meanwhile, those who wished to explore reality were free to do so, using the remotely controlled drones from earlier. Those who wanted to explore were encouraged to mine the nearby asteroid belts for the metal and resources they need to make repairs in the computer. And if nobody wanted to explore reality, they could send automated machines to do the mining instead. This was the state that the high streamer cosmonauts found their long-lost brethren, floating aimlessly through the endless expanses of space, but concealed within their mechanical dream. I don't mean to imply the dreamers were mournful of their existence. In fact, the majority were pretty happy. But they had lost touch with reality, at least for a while. After their accidental discovery of the high streamers, the mechanical dream was given a new lease on life outside of the simulation. Together, the dream and the streamers began to explore once again, colonizing new worlds and rediscovering the ruins of an ancient Age society. Countless high streamers were fascinated by the lure of life inside of the dream. But just as they began to enter the simulation, there were just as many dreamers that abandoned their mechanical world for a second biological life. Sometimes the high streamers would donate their bodies as a vessel for dreamers that wished to leave the simulation. Other times, an entirely new vessel would be grown, kind of like a clone. But as the years wore on and the two societies melded into one, the majority of people would fall into something similar to the following life trajectory. From birth to death, they'd live as a biological body. Then, just before they died, their mind would be transferred to the mechanical dream, where they would live for as long as they liked in a simulated world of their choosing. This system worked quite well for them, and even now, thousands of years later, the high streamers and the mechanical dreamers live together in harmony, having bested time and death. This age of practical immortality probably won't last forever, but that's as far as we'll go today. Obviously, I'd like to thank the wonderful people on my Discord server who have helped me develop the lore of this species, especially the brand new members who made their foyer because of the previous video. According to 404 Air, there's 146 of you guys, which is kind of crazy in its own right. But I'd also like to mention everyone from the comment sections in the last video, who have pointed out some of the holes present in the story and convinced me to actually mention where the Ages get their metal from. I especially appreciate Brian Hurt, who tried his best to think of a solution for how an animal could ever actually get this massive. And also Fidel Marxlin, who gave the most interesting reason for why an animal could probably never get this big. Anyway, thank you guys for all the help and all the critiques, but the biggest thank you has got to go to my patrons for their continued support, including Lord Frostdragon the Deranged, Justin Shinkolpet, MTL, Toothy Jones, Edgy Electrokinetic, and JJ Walker. You guys are what makes it all possible. But until next time, don't die. See you guys later.
Rome wasn't built in a day. Again. Rome wasn't built